Have you ever felt like there's so much more going on inside your head, than you're really aware of?
Yeah, definitely.
Like there's this incredible intricate systems, like driving your thoughts and, actions and stuff, but you can only kind of see the surface level.
Right.
It's kind of like that built-in navigation system that we were looking at in one of the sources. Like, it's there and it's guiding you.
Yeah, it's in the background.
But actually understanding like how it all works, that's what feels really out of reach.
It really does. Like you're kind of just along for the ride, but you don't have the full picture.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we're going to try to explore today.
Right.
Kind of get a better understanding of that. It's almost like being an operator of this like really complex machine.
It is.
Which is your own mind. But, there's like hidden levers and dials that you don't even know exist, but they're influencing how you think, how you feel, all of it.
100%.
So today we are going to be talking about Carl Jung.
Yes.
We've been digging into this awesome transcript from the Art of Thinking YouTube channel.
It's a great channel.
Yeah, they have a lot of really cool stuff. And it's all about his really groundbreaking ideas about the human psyche.
Yeah, he was really fascinated by that internal machine, as the transcript puts it. Like his whole life's work was just dedicated to understanding the psyche, and not just the bits we're aware of, but like the whole intricate.
And for you, our listener, this deep dive is basically going to be like a shortcut.
Yeah.
We're going to be extracting the core of Jung's insights, and especially his view of this kind of inner landscape.
Right.
All the stuff that's going on under the hood.
Exactly.
So our mission today is to try and help you gain a better understanding of your own internal navigation system. So you can move through life with more intention, experience more aha moments, and maybe like steer clear of some potholes along the way.
Exactly. I love that.
Yeah. So let's get into it. We want to start by looking at kind of like, what were the early influences in his life?
Right.
Because it's such a different way of looking at psychology that you kind of wonder, like, how did this even come about?
Right. Yeah, it's a big question.
So, like, where did his deep dive into the mind even begin?
So we're going back to his early life in Switzerland. He was born in 1875.
Okay.
And right away, you look at his parents and you kind of see some significant potential influences there. His father was a rural shepherd.
Okay.
Which I think probably exposed him to a more kind of introspective way of life, just being out in nature and the rhythms of nature and things like that.
Yeah, it's a different pace of life.
Yeah, totally. His mother, on the other hand, she was described as being depressive, eccentric, and even, it sounds like, had some, spiritual visions.
Wow, so that's a pretty interesting combination, like one foot in the real world and then also this kind of otherworldly aspect.
Totally. And I feel like, for someone like Jung, a mind like his, that must have been a really fertile ground, to start thinking about the inner life.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And the transcript also, it highlights like his early introversion.
Okay.
He would spend long periods just kind of like lost in his own imaginative play, being introspective and just being, really observant of the adults around him too.
Okay.
Like really paying attention. So it seems like from an early age, he was kind of drawn to trying to understand what was going on beneath the surface of things.
Yeah, that's fascinating. But, school, as I recall, wasn't like a super positive experience for him.
No, not at all. He really didn't thrive in that kind of structured environment.
Yeah, it sounds like it was kind of the opposite of what he needed.
It was really stifling for him. And it's interesting because he actually developed these physical symptoms, like fainting spells.
What?
Yeah, and it seems like it was almost like a way for him to escape those obligations, like a way to get out of that situation that was so stressful for him.
Wow, that's a pretty intense reaction.
It is.
So how did he eventually, get on a different path? What was, the turning point for him?
Well, it seems like there was a pretty concerning conversation with his father at one point.
Oh, okay.
Where his father were basically like, what are you going to do with your life? What's your future going to look like?
Yeah.
Expressing his concern. And that really seems to have galvanized Jung into becoming a much more dedicated student.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, he started, just devouring books on his own, particularly in philosophy and religious texts.
Oh, wow.
And these early explorations really had a huge impact on his later.
So that's really interesting. It goes from these fainting spells to really deep philosophical inquiry.
Yeah.
That's quite a shift.
It is.
And then ultimately, did he decide to go into ministry or something like that?
Well, actually, he chose to study medicine.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of surprising. But it makes sense in a way because, he was so fascinated by the human mind. He studied first at the University of Basel.
Okay.
And then he specialized in psychiatry at the University of Zurich.
Got it.
And he got his doctorate in 1902. So even though he was really drawn to philosophy and religion, he ended up going down this more kind of scientific path to explore those big questions that fascinated him.
Yeah, because I guess with medicine, you're getting into like the actual mechanics of the brain.
Yeah.
Right. But still, like you said, you always had that kind of spiritual side.
Yeah, exactly. And, working in the field of psychiatry, especially in his early career, that really played a key role in shaping his ideas, too.
Tell me about that.
So he started out working in a psychiatric hospital under Eugen Bleuler.
Okay.
And Bleuler was a very well-respected psychiatrist who had done a lot of groundbreaking work on schizophrenia.
Okay.
So Jung was exposed to these, patients with these really extreme mental conditions that a lot of the existing psychological theories at the time just couldn't really explain.
Right.
And I think that really pushed him to search for a deeper, more integrative approach to understanding the psyche, to try to make sense of what he was seeing.
And that's kind of, I guess, what led him to Freud.
Yeah, that's right. So in 1907, Jung met Sigmund Freud for the first time.
Okay.
And Freud, he was already a big name in psychoanalysis, like a really towering figure.
Of course, yeah.
And their first meeting was pretty extraordinary. I mean, they talked for like 13 hours straight.
What, 13 hours?
Yeah.
Wow, that's a lot of talking.
It is. It must have been like mentally exhausting, but also exhilarating.
I mean, it definitely shows that there was a strong intellectual connection between them.
Oh, for sure. And they actually, pretty quickly developed this close friendship and professional partnership.
Mm-hmm.
And for several years, they just exchanged ideas constantly. They analyzed dreams. They gave lectures and debates together. They even traveled together.
Wow.
And their collaboration had a huge impact on the development of modern psychology.
Yeah, they were kind of like the dynamic duo of psychology at the time.
Yeah, totally. But even though they were so close, eventually some tensions started to emerge.
Yeah.
As, often happens in these kinds of really intense partnerships.
Right. When you have such strong personalities, there's bound to be some friction.
For sure. And the source mentions that there were some underlying tensions, because Freud was older and already established. He was kind of in this mentoring position.
Yeah, the senior partner.
Yeah. And as Jung's own ideas and his career were maturing, he started to find that position a little bit restrictive.
Okay. So it was kind of like he was outgrowing that dynamic.
Yeah. But there are also these more fundamental differences in their theoretical viewpoint.
Right. I mean, they're both such pioneers in their own right.
Right.
It makes sense that they would have different ideas.
Yeah, and those differences really started to cause some friction between.
So what were those key areas where they really started to see things differently?
So Freud's approach, it tended to be very scientific and reductive.
Okay.
He would often look for the root causes of psychological issues in, very specific personal experiences.
Right.
Especially early childhood trauma.
Mm-hmm.
But Jung, he was starting to be drawn to broader and more spiritual concepts.
Okay.
He was really interested in the mystical and symbolic elements of the unconscious. So that was a big difference. Freud was very focused on the individual history and kind of the physical.
Okay.
Whereas Jung was starting to explore these more universal and symbolic realms.
Okay. So kind of a micro versus macro view of the psyche.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And eventually these differences, they just became too big to ignore.
Right.
And they led to this definitive and pretty painful break between.
Wow. So it wasn't an amicable parting of ways.
No, it doesn't sound like it was. The source actually describes it as a deep psychological crisis for Jung.
Wow, that's heavy. I mean, I can imagine it's not just a professional breakup.
Right.
But it's also losing a friend, a mentor.
Exactly. I mean, Freud had been such a crucial figure in his life, like a father figure in a way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah, it was a big upheaval for him.
But it sounds like instead of being completely, devastated by this, he actually channeled it into something really productive.
He did. It's pretty remarkable.
How so?
So the period from 1913 to 1918 is actually what Jung himself referred to as a psychic breakdown. But instead of letting it consume him, he kind of used this really intense inner experience as a catalyst for introspection and experiment.
Okay, so he turned inwards.
Yeah, he really delved deep into his own psyche. He was meticulously recording his dreams, his fantasies, his active imagination.
So it was almost like his personal crisis became his most important laboratory?
Yeah, that's the right way to put it.
So having gone through that, what do you think became his central mission after that?
Right. Well, As the source puts it, Jung's main objective from then on was to understand the fundamental nature of the human mind and to develop methods that would enable all its diverse components to be brought together into a unified state of completeness.
Okay.
And the way he saw it, the psyche was like the totality of an individual's person.
Right.
Encompassing all their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
So everything, not just the, surface level stuff.
Exactly. And he believed that most of this psyche was actually in the unconscious realm.
Okay.
So beyond our direct awareness.
So it's like this whole hidden world that we're not even aware of is actually driving so much of who we are.
Exactly. And he believed that the unconscious held our true desires, inherent capacities, and underlying motive.
Okay.
Like things that we might not even be consciously aware of.
And that, I guess, is where this idea of individuation comes in.
Yes, exactly. Jung believed that the whole purpose of life is to bring those hidden elements to light through this process of integration and self-knowledge. And that journey he called individuation.
Okay.
A big word.
It is.
But it's a really powerful concept.
So can you kind of break that down a little bit? Like, what exactly does individuation mean in practice?
So basically, it's about making the unconscious conscious.
Okay.
Bringing those hidden parts of ourselves into the light of awareness. It's kind of like, imagine you have this big puzzle.
Okay.
And your ego is only showing you a few of the pieces.
Right.
The ones that are already brightly lit.
Okay.
But individuation is about turning on the lights in the darker corners and seeing all those other.
So you can finally see the whole picture.
Exactly. Even the pieces that at first, seem to be dusty or don't seem to fit.
Or maybe you don't even want to see them.
Exactly. But by acknowledging all the pieces, then you can finally see the whole picture and become a more, complete and authentic.
Right, because I guess our ego is kind of like, trying to protect us from those parts of ourselves that might be uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly. The ego likes to have a comfortable and coherent narrative about.
Right. It likes to keep things nice and tidy.
Totally. And so it often acts like a gatekeeper, trying to block any unconscious content that doesn't fit with its preferred self-image.
So it kind of curates our reality a little bit.
Right. It might ignore or even actively repress aspects of the psyche that seem threatening or foreign to its identity.
So basically, we might be walking around with all these blind spots that are carefully maintained by our ego.
Yeah, and Jung believed that our main task is to actually confront those repressed parts.
Okay.
To accept them as part of the whole, and to integrate them into our conscious awareness.
Okay.
And that, he believed, was the key to living a more balanced and meaningful.
Okay, so that's super interesting. Now, can we get into the structure of the psyche as he saw it?
Yeah, let's do that.
Because we talked about the conscious and the unconscious, but is there more to it than that?
There is.
Okay.
So Jung basically proposed a model with these three main levels.
Okay.
So you've got consciousness,
Okay.
which we've already talked about a little bit. It's the domain of our active perception and rational thought.
Right.
The ego kind of sits at the center of that and gives us that sense of a continuous I.
Like the me that I experience every day.
Exactly. But Jung emphasized that the ego is only a tiny fraction of the whole psychic landscape.
Right.
It's not the whole story.
Okay, so then what's next?
So then you've got the personal unconscious.
Okay.
And that's where we start to see some overlap with Freud's ideas about the unconscious.
Yeah.
Jung described the personal unconscious as this storehouse of repressed personal experience. Things like memories that have been forgotten or pushed aside.
Okay.
And also impulses that maybe don't align with the ego's self-image.
Yeah, like stuff that we're not necessarily proud of or that we don't want to admit to ourselves.
Right. And even though these things are outside our conscious awareness, they still influence us.
Okay.
They affect our actions, feelings, and behaviors in all sorts of subtle.
So it's like they're pulling the strings from behind the scenes.
Exactly. And Jung built upon those foundational concepts from Freud, but then he went even further.
And that's where we get to this really mind-blowing concept of the collective unconscious, right?
Exactly. This is probably Jung's most revolutionary idea.
Okay, so tell me about that. Like, what is the collective unconscious?
So he theorized that it's this universal reservoir of psychological structures and patterns
Okay.
that we inherit just by being human. Like it's passed down through evolution.
So it's not based on our personal experiences
Not just that.
or even our cultural background.
It goes even deeper than that. It's like a psychological heritage shared by all of humanity.
Wow, that's a really big idea. So basically, we're not just blank slates when we're born. We come pre-programmed with certain psychological tendencies.
That's exactly what Jung.
So it's kind of like we all have this like shared blueprint for how we experience the world.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's where the idea of archetypes comes in, right?
Exactly. Archetypes are like these universal representations.
Okay.
Or patterns that shape how we experience the world, ourselves, and our relationships.
Okay. And so what led him to this idea of archetypes? Like, what evidence did he see that made him think that these things exist?
Well, he drew evidence from a lot of places, like from his work with patients,
Okay.
his study of mythology from all these different cultures,
Okay.
the symbolism in art across different eras, and just recurring patterns that he saw throughout history.
Okay. So what was he seeing specifically?
So he noticed these recurring symbolic patterns.
Okay.
Not just in his patients' dreams and fantasies, but also in the myths and legends and religious of cultures that were totally unconnected, like they had no contact with each other.
Wow, that's amazing.
It is, and to Jung, that suggested that there was some kind of shared psychological basis.
Right. Like something that's universal to all humans.
Yeah, and it's not just abstract theory. I mean, understanding those shared patterns can give you a lot of insight into why certain stories resonate with us across cultures, and why we react to certain symbols almost instinctively.
Yeah. Like, I was thinking about that the other day. You see the hero archetype in like every story ever told.
Right.
It doesn't matter what culture it's from. It's always there.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, like, why are we all so drawn to that story?
Right.
I guess it's because it's tapping into something that's already there inside us.
Exactly. These inherited patterns are powerful. So I can give you some concrete examples of these archetypes, if you'd like.
Yeah, let's do that because it's such a big concept.
Okay.
It's helpful to have, like, specific examples.
So one of the most prominent archetypes is the hero.
Okay.
And this represents the struggle against adversity.
Okay.
And the desire to overcome challenges.
Right.
And it's everywhere. You see it in Greek mythology with figures like Hercules,
right,
facing those impossible labors.
Yeah.
You see it in modern superhero narratives.
Yeah.
It's just this universal human need to find meaning and purpose by, confronting obstacles and striving for victory.
Yeah, it's kind of built into our DNA.
Right.
Now, what's another key archetype that we should know about?
Another crucial one is the shadow.
Shadow, okay.
Yeah.
That sounds kind of ominous.
It is a little bit. It represents the darker aspects of the psyche. All the stuff that we tend to repress or deny or reject self.
Oh, okay, like our flaws and our, negative tendencies.
Yeah, all of that.
Okay.
But even though we try to ignore it, it still has a huge...
Oh, so it's not like we can just pretend it's not there.
Exactly. Jung really emphasized that ignoring the shadow can be dangerous.
Okay.
Because those unacknowledged aspects, they can kind of like fester and then manifest in destructive ways.
Right.
Both internally and externally.
So what's the key to dealing with the shadow?
So the key is to recognize it,
okay,
to accept, but to do it with compassion and awareness.
So not to judge ourselves for having those aspects.
Right. And by doing that, we can start to move towards a more authentic and balanced.
That makes sense. But I'm curious, like, how do you even start to do that?
That's a great question. It's definitely easier said than done. But Jung suggested things like dream analysis and active imagination as ways to start bringing the shadow into conscious awareness.
Okay.
And just paying attention to how we react to other people.
Okay.
Like, what triggers strong negative emotions in us can also give us clues about our own shadow.
Right, because those things are often a reflection of something that we're trying to suppress in ourselves.
So
it's about being really honest with ourselves and being willing to, like, look at those parts of ourselves that we don't necessarily want to see.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be like this big, scary thing. You can start with small steps, like, journaling about those uncomfortable feelings.
Right.
Trying to understand why certain qualities in others really bother us.
Yeah.
It's about just becoming more.
Okay, that's helpful. And so we have a hero in the shadow.
Right.
Are there other archetypes that we should know about?
Oh, yeah, tons.
Okay, cool.
But some other important ones are the sage, which represents wisdom.
Okay.
And the pursuit of knowledge.
Yeah.
The mother, which symbolizes nurturing and care and, the life-giving principle. The lover, which is all about connection and passion and relationships.
Right.
And the trickster, which is often associated with, disruption and change.
Interesting.
And kind of like challenging the status quo.
So we all have these different archetypes at play within us.
Yeah, and they're all interacting with each other in complex ways.
Okay.
And Jung also explored these concepts of the anima and the animus.
Right. Can you tell me about those?
So the anima, that refers to the repressed feminine traits that exist.
Okay.
And the animus is the opposite. It's the repressed masculine traits in women.
Okay, I see.
And Jung believed that it's really important to integrate these seemingly opposing aspects within ourselves, that it's actually essential to achieving individuation and moving towards.
So it's like not being afraid to embrace both our masculine and feminine sides.
Exactly.
Regardless of our gender.
Yeah, it allows us to access a much wider range of emotions and thoughts and behaviors than we might typically be comfortable with.
Okay.
And it leads to a more balanced and authentic life.
Okay.
So it's about moving beyond those rigid gender stereotypes and becoming more whole.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Right.
And so all of these different elements that we've talked about, the conscious and unconscious, the personal and collective, the archetypes, the anima and animus.
Right.
Do they all come together under one umbrella?
Yeah, ultimately they're all kind of oriented towards this central archetype called the self.
The self, okay.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
So the self is the center of the entire psyche.
Okay.
It's like the unifying force that brings the conscious and the unconscious together. And it represents the true core of our personality.
Okay, so it's like the real you.
Yeah, the essence of who we truly are.
Okay.
Beyond all our ego identifications, the social masks we wear, the stories we tell ourselves.
So like the part of us that's unchanging.
Yeah, like the deepest, truest part of.
And that's what we're trying to get in touch with through individuation.
Exactly. The aim of individuation is to try to align our ego, our conscious sense of self, with the self.
Okay.
So that deeper essence.
And I guess that's where the integration of the shadow comes in again, right?
Yeah, it's a really important piece of the puzzle.
Because we can't really become whole if we're denying parts of ourselves.
Exactly.
So remind me again, why is it so important to confront the shadow?
So the shadow is, all those darker aspects of ourselves, the parts that we try to hide even from ourselves.
Right.
But Jung said that ignoring the shadow doesn't make it go away.
Yeah, it's still there lurking in the background.
Right. And in fact, it often allows it to operate unconsciously.
Okay.
So it might be driving our thoughts and feelings and actions without us even realizing.
Right.
He used this great metaphor to describe it. He said, just as we can't escape the shadow of our body by running away from it, we can't escape our psychological shadow.
That's a really powerful image.
Yeah.
So basically, we can't outrun those parts of ourselves.
Exactly.
We have to face them eventually.
And when we try to deny or repress the shadow, it actually just makes it stronger. It can lead to these unexpected outbursts or projections onto other people.
Oh, right, because we're not dealing with it directly, so it's coming out in these unhealthy ways.
Exactly. But when we integrate the shadow, we're consciously acknowledging those parts of ourselves.
Okay.
And that allows us to make more conscious.
Right.
Instead of being driven by those unconscious.
Okay.
So it's about taking back control.
So even though it's hard, there are real benefits to doing that work.
Definitely. I mean, it leads to a much deeper understanding of ourselves.
Okay.
And the ability to live a more fulfilling life.
Okay.
It's not about becoming perfect.
Right. So as we're wrapping up here, what's the key takeaway that you want our listeners to leave with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that it's so important to go on this journey of self-knowledge.
Yeah.
And to actively work to integrate the conscious and unconscious parts of ourselves.
Right.
Jung showed us that these aren't separate things. They're deeply interconnected.
Right. They're both part of who we are.
Exactly. And the unconscious, it's not something to be afraid of.
Yeah.
It's actually a powerful ally full of untapped potential.
And I love that point about it being like a shortcut to gaining knowledge.
Yeah.
Because when you understand those Jungian principles, it gives you this framework for taking more control of that internal navigation system we were talking about earlier.
Right. When we engage with the depths of our own unconscious, we can really understand what motivates us, what drives our behavior, and ultimately navigate our lives with more awareness and intention.
So we're not just wandering around aimlessly.
Right.
We're actually making conscious choices.
Exactly.
So as a final thought for our listeners, think about what you might be avoiding or haven't fully confronted in yourself. What repetitive patterns do you see in your life?
Yeah.
Are there things that are coming up over and over again that might be rooted in unconscious beliefs or unacknowledged parts of yourself?
It's worth thinking about.
Yeah.
And what about those times when your shadow might have influenced your decisions or your reaction?
Right.
What can you learn from those experiences?
Yeah, because those are often really valuable clues.
They are.
And, even though that